Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the Shea Anything podcast. It's Doug Williams and Andy Martino with you this Monday. Bad news, the Mets did not make the playoffs. This is our first postseason episode. The good news is, though, that we're not going anywhere. We have today's episode. We'll have a season recap with Keith on Thursday. And then throughout the offseason, we'll be with you every Monday. So it'll be some me, some Andy, some Keith. You'll hear from all three of us as the offseason progresses. And we're not going anywhere again. If you're just listening to this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review where you can, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever. But, you know, it's going to be a busy off season, everybody. So we want to make sure that we're here for you every week as we navigate it. We have new ownership coming in, potentially big moves, who knows, lots of important decisions to be made. So we'll be there to cover it all. Since we last spoke, the Mets needed to go on a run, really the story of their 60-game season. The Mets needed to go on a 3 or 4 game winning streak, and they just couldn't do it. They finished the year 2-2 since we last spoke. The season ends at 26-34 on the year. Andy, in our rundown, one of the bullet points is what happened and what's next. That could be the entire podcast. It's one of like 6 things we have to do on this episode. Let's start with what happened, though. Other than what I just said, that the Mets just could not string wins together for the entire year. What do you think, if you were to tell this story, what do you think the story of the Mets 2020 season was?
There's a lot of different ways we could obviously go with this, Doug, but the number one thing I think that springs to mind is that the starting pitching just wasn't there to cover for the team's deficiencies, as it was last season to some extent. Yeah. I believe they won 86 games in 2019, because in the second half, they had one of the best rotations in baseball. This year, they had a similarly flawed position player core of guys who were playing out of position or did one thing well, but another thing poorly, or like a guy like J.D. Davis who hurts you on one side of the ball but helps you on another. It's a weird roster construction anyway, and they just didn't have the pitching to cover for it. And I think that's really boils down to when you lost Syndergaard and Stroman. In retrospect, they were done, and that's it to me.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it simplifies things in the right way because we talk about the 2015 run a lot, and I talk about it with Anthony Recker a lot in studio, and I'm like, it's so funny because that team was so flawed. Travis d'Arnaud, before he turned into the player he is now, was behind the plate. You had Lucas Duda at first, and then Ruben Tejada got hurt, and that was a big loss at short. You had Wilmer Flores on a World Series team playing shortstop, and then you're reminded, the pitching was dominant. And that's what led. It helps. Not only does it help, but it causes runs a lot of the time. The Mets just didn't have the consistent starting pitching this year. So I do think that that's the perfect way to simplify it. And then as for the what's next, Andy, as I said at the top of the podcast, we're going to be busy this offseason doing these episodes because we know it's going to be a busy offseason with Steve Cohen coming in. And there's a lot up in the air. But what's next as of right now, as of what you know, because I know there's so much we don't know, what do you think it is?
Well, what's going on right now and will also be what's next. It's going to go on for a little while is Steve Cohen has to politic and lobby enough other owners to get his 23 out of 30 votes. One of those votes is the Mets, so you can count one in the bank at least. But he has to get the votes. And I've done a lot of reporting on this. I think a lot of Mets fans don't want to believe it because they just want this to be a done deal. But I can tell you for a fact that there are plenty of other owners. Well, I should say there are a few other owners who are really concerned, including I continue to hear Jerry Reinsdorf in Chicago, although Reinsdorf denied that to me. It continues to be a lot of talk about this, leading a group of some others who might be on the fence about, there's ostensible concerns about Cohen's business history, but come on. Jim Crane was literally sued for war profiteering and racism and got approved. So it's not a real high bar there in this group, but a bigger concern probably for other owners is that they were worried that Cohen's going to spend a lot and that it's going to make them look bad. Sorry, folks, but that's the real talk there. And that's something that's going on. The attachment of Sandy Alderson to Cohen will help with that because he's been a guy who's been fiscally responsible his whole 40-year baseball career. He's not the spend like a drunken sailor baseball ops guy. He never has been. He had a high payroll in Oakland, and with the Mets, he had a high payroll when it was time. But he's not the guy that's just going to go out and buy every free agent like the Padres did a couple years ago, or the Angels continue to do unsuccessfully. That's not going to be Sandy. So that's going to help. And as Cohen lobbies these other owners individually, that's going to be part of his pitch. So that's what's next. I will say, as I've written, I think he'll ultimately be approved. But that's literally the process that has to go on to make that happen.
So in a sport without a salary cap, I mean, lots of incentives for getting under luxury taxes, et cetera. But if you're Steve Cohen and you're worth $14 billion, the other owners are worried that he's literally, why would I not spend? And just signs every player because he can afford to.
Right. Yeah. And the industry is cratering money right now. And definitely other owners want us to be very, very much believing that they lost so much money this year that the free agent market's going to be terrible. So if you have one guy buying everybody, that's just going to disrupt the apple cart a little bit. I don't know that's going to happen. Look, I've been working for weeks now on reporting on what I think Cohen's going to do and what kind of owner he's going to be like. And I think he's going to do things that are going to be way more important and good and way better than just buying the hottest player on the market in the short term. I think he's going to, with Alderson behind him, I think he's going to invest heavily in research and development. Seems like the Yankees and the Dodgers have literally dozens of analysts in their offices. A team like the Mets has a few. The Oakland A's, Alderson's coming from a lower budget team, used to be obviously with Moneyball, used to be on the forefront of stats. Now they're way behind. They don't have this big R&D department. I think the Mets will invest heavily there. I think they'll heavily invest in strength and conditioning and training and biomechanics and all these things that are real cutting edge and require a lot of back end investment. That's why the Dodgers and the Yankees are successful year in and year out, because they have all that stuff hidden from public view. And that's the kind of lavish spending I think Cohen's gonna do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too to point out that the nightmare scenario for the other owners and the worry that he may not get approved is not necessarily just because the other owners are cheap or that they're saying 2020 they were hemorrhaging money or anything like that. It's a real concern that you could have an owner who would just sign everybody, because that would be bad for the league and bad for baseball. But I think there's, to your point, there's reason to believe that won't be true. And I don't think Steve Cohen's a smart businessman. That's how you make that money. And
right.
I think he understands how he gets approved and how this will work. In terms of the baseball side, Andy, of what's next, I mean, what do you think Sandy will aim to do? What do you think? Like, that's the one decision we know about. What can you learn from that decision from Steve Cohen?
Well, the things I just mentioned, the investment in infrastructure, back end, R&D. I mean, there are organizations who are very wealthy who literally have guys whose entire jobs are like special projects. Go have a weird idea. Like, figure out if guys with especially long middle fingers throw a better curveball than anyone else. I'm making that up, but literally you have guys who like do stuff like this in the rich organizations. So Sandy wants to have all that stuff, I'm sure. Just all kinds of interesting. This is the guy who brought advanced stats, who brought Bill James into baseball in the early 1980s. And the current way to be ahead of the curve is to do this kind of stuff. And that's what he wants to do. I think that's more important than does he like JT Realmuto and stuff. Like, these are the big things that Sandy wants to do. We know through him being a baseball guy here in New York for a long time that he likes on base percentage. He likes a certain kind of player. He likes a manager that'll follow the script. We know who he is pretty well as a baseball guy, but we also know he's flexible. He never wanted Yoenis Cespedes. That's not his kind of player. But opportunistically, that was the guy available that day. He went and traded for him. So I think he has a style like we can remember, but it's also flexible depending on context.
Yeah. Okay, let's do a 3-batter rule, and it'll be kind of the season recap version. So instead of specific players, your answers can be specific players, but it's more of a long-term effects conversation. So it's going to be one good thing in 2020, one bad thing to come out of 2020, and then one rule change you want to keep in 2021 for the weirdness that's been the 2020 season, one thing that you think worked. I'll do one good thing first, then I'll let you do one bad thing first. So one good thing for me, and I actually just was really thinking about this, and I think it's that McNeil, Alonso, there were struggles, sophomore slumps. Both of them, in some ways, really ended up coming out of it. Jeff McNeil obviously was really turned on, and you saw why he is a really great hitter. I'm not worried about him anymore, and that's a really good thing. But the other is that, Pete Alonso ended the season with an OPS over 800. And I think if this year had been a total disaster for him, like it felt like it was a lot of the year, it would be kind of leaving him lost going into next year. But the fact that he ended his year on a strong note, that he knows that he can still have success when he feels he's at rock bottom, I think that's really important for the Mets moving forward. And I know, Dom Smith is such a revelation and had such a huge year. But one of the things that I've been talking to Keith about this year, Andy, and this is also a point you've made, is not to take too much out of one season for anybody. So nothing against Dom. I think he's going to be a really good hitter for a long time, but I'm just trying not to read too much.
Overdo it. Yeah.
In how great his numbers were this year, because it does not mean that they'll translate next year, just like Pete's last year did not translate this year. So I just think it's really good for the Mets building and moving forward that McNeil and Alonso both ended up in fairly decent places going into next year after this odd season. What would you say one good thing to come out of 2020 was, Andy?
I think that above anything that happened with an individual player, the fact that Sandy Alderson's back with the team is just massive. I mean, I don't want to, I even though we just talked about it, like that is the top line answer to that question for me, because as you just said, individual performances come and go. But I mean, I can't tell you how happy so many people in that organization are to be working with someone again who they have so much respect for. You're talking about a Hall of Fame caliber executive who we thought was gone forever, who's now back, a guy who led them into success in a very challenging time for the franchise over his first couple of years. So that change is just no matter what happens underneath him in the baseball operations, having Sandy Alderson leading the team is better than anything that any player did this year, in my opinion.
And full disclosure, I was thinking about going with Dom Smith and his season and a lot of what it meant big picture for my one good thing, but we're going to talk about Dom a little more specifically in just a second in your conversations with him. So we'll save that for that. One bad thing in 2020, Andy?
Well, I'm gonna say my answer that I have prepared and then say one thing about what you just said. Number one bad thing is that I think the starting pitching is in such bad shape that I have a hard time seeing a path to it being significantly better next year, because Matz's career seems to have sort of cratered. Syndergaard's not coming back at the beginning of the year, and he'll be coming off Tommy John, which is a year that guys typically can struggle anyway. DeGrom's going to be a year older. I don't have any reason to think he won't be good, but I don't really know what's behind him in the rotation next year. Yeah, you can sign Trevor Bauer, but I just think that they have a real depth issue in the rotation that's going to be hard to address for a while. I slightly disagree with your optimistic comment about Alonso, because the power was there, but I think a lot of the things he was doing, like a lot of the conversations that I had with Todd trying to understand Alonso's season, Todd Zeal, and listening to Keith on the air and talking some with him, and you talked to Keith a lot. It seems like the stuff that Alonso was doing, like chasing bad pitches, he was getting beat on the inside fastball, expanding on the breaking ball, trying to pull too much, completely seeming to get out of what he has articulated that he's done so well in the past, which is use the middle of the field. All these things still were problems, I think, mostly through September. He just is strong enough where he ran into the home runs. So he was like Rob Deere or something, even at his best, an allusion to like a 199 hitter with power, the kind of guy. So, and that's so much worse than what we saw last year when he was not just a home run hitter, but a good hitter. So I'm not comforted by what I saw towards the end with Pete.
Well, I totally agree with all of that. But here's what I would say. And one of the points that Keith and I talked about last week was, you notice how tightly Pete's gripping the bat. And Ron points out that at one point, Pete came up to the plate, he's chewing gum. And I was like, I've never seen that before. He's like chomping on bubble gum at the plate. What Keith was saying was when Wilson Ramos came out and said, I miss my family. I think that's a big part of my struggles this year. The routine is so different. And we were saying it's possible, and we're speculating, that, Pete, even on a night where he goes 1 for 4, he's in their hotel room or he's in his apartment. He's got nothing else going on but thinking of how he made those 3 outs. Sure. And there's something to be said about distractions in life. And this goes for everybody. Most people listening, I'm sure, that your job becomes so much a part of your life, not just when you're working, but after you're working, if you don't have distractions from it. So we were talking about that and how mentally it must have been a challenge for Pete. But also, Andy, part of my point is that just how bad it's looked. I think if you're Pete, you look back and you're like, okay, it'll never get worse than that. It will never feel worse than that at the plate for me. That was awful. And look, I salvaged it. I led the team in home runs. So once you know how bad it can get, like I use this comparison a lot, Andy. First Geico Sports Night I ever did at SNY, prompter went out.
I know.
It was like I was doing a show with no pants on. That's how awful it felt. It felt so bad. And I was halfway through the script and I was
like right now, because we only see your top half at the moment.
Yeah, you don't know if I have pants on. But
Go on.
Halfway through the script, I realized I did not have it memorized, and I just freaked out and had to toss to some sound. And then I was mortified and I didn't want to come back to work the next day. And I was 23 years old. But moving forward, it was great because it's the worst thing that can happen. And once it happens, you've ripped that Band-Aid off. It's no longer a fear of oh, what if that happens? Well, Pete's had a really tough year and a bad year at times. So he doesn't have to worry about that happening anymore. I think that might help him mentally.
Well, we're gonna find out how we know he's talented enough. We're gonna find out how he responds to that situation mentally and emotionally. We'll learn. Some guy, Matt Harvey never came back from his first adversity after being a star when he burst on the scene. That happens too. So we'll see if he follows the Doug Williams heroic bravery mode or whether he goes in the Matt Harvey direction.
Yeah.
Next year we'll tell the tale.
I wanted that. The takeaway there, Andy, is you so rightly put it, that I'm a brave hero. That
you are. I mean, I think I know you're being modest by trying to play that off, but that's how I did hear that story. And Matt Harvey wasn't several years ago. So we'll see which way Pete goes. There are 2 emotional directions to take.
You're right. You're right. Doug Williams greater than Matt Harvey. That's the takeaway. That's the episode.
I would rather hang out with you this coming weekend than Matt Harvey. So maybe you are better than Matt Harvey. I would. I really would.
Well, I mean, you and I are friends. I think it would be weird if you wanted to hang out with somebody you're not friends with in front of me.
There's a lot of people I'd rather hang out with, I don't know, Tom Hanks than you this weekend, even though Tom and I aren't friends. I think that'd be interesting.
That's true. Okay. Let's move on. One bad thing for me in 2020. Well, I guess I should have prepared for this. I think starting pitching is where I'm going to go too, Andy. I know that's boring. That's where I was going to go. So I guess I could have known to pivot off of what you said, but I agree with you that I'm not sure you can fix the rotation in time for opening day next year. And if that's going to be the thing that brought the Mets down in 2020, it would be nice to be able to feel like you have a solution ready to go for next year. But I mean, if David Peterson's your number 3 starter next year, I'm not sure you can go into the year thinking things will be a lot better. Could they sign Trevor Bauer? Yeah, absolutely. And would that be a great 1-2 punch potentially with the 2 Cy Young favorites with DeGrom and Bauer? Yeah. But
yeah, that's not bad actually.
No, it would be good. But again, we've had one ace in the Mets rotation for 2 years, almost 3 years now. And it really hasn't mattered. They have not been a playoff team for Jacob deGrom's great peak years. And if you add another great starter, it helps, but you need to be a better all-around team. So,
and by the way, DeGrom, I think, is 32 right now. he's not going to be at this level forever. One of these years, it will come down a notch. And that's just the natural progression of things. So
he struggled with his health this year.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's a good point. He was actually injured several times in minor ways in a short season. I'm not saying those are indicators of things to come, but you can't just put him in ink as the, best pitcher in the world year in, year out, year in, year out. At some point, you're going to have other depth too. And look at a team like Cleveland that doesn't have to, they could lose. They lost Shane Bieber right now. That would be pretty deadly. But obviously over the past couple of years, they built the rotation around Kluber, long gone, Bauer, Clevenger. I mean, the Indians have developed enough high-end pitching to continually get rid of guys. And the Mets, if you don't have Jacob deGrom, the Mets are going to win 30 games next year, even if they play 162. So, they're he shouldn't be that important. You should have more pitching depth than that.
30 and 132 would be a bad year.
It would. It really would. Bad beginning of the new Alderson era to win 30 games in the full season.
One rule change you want to keep in 2021. This might be a boring answer, but I keep the universal DH. I think pitchers are going to all have jobs. And I think this year it's shown how much worth that rule change can provide for position players who struggle at their positions, but are still great offensively. And I think that's fun to watch great hitters be able to do what they do. And, you have guys like Robinson Cano or JD Martinez or Nelson Cruz. These guys are able to be great while not being burdened by having to play a position. And I think it helps teams as well navigate their roster and gives people like Dom Smith, when Cespedes was still here, an ability to prove himself. And I don't think I've missed for 1 second pitchers batting.
Mm-hmm.
Andy, what rule change would you continue from 2021?
Well, how I feel about 7-inning games, but I want those long term, and I think that time will come. But for next year in the real world, I really, really, really love the extra inning rule. It causes so much fun tension in an extra inning game right off the bat. All right, we just finished 9. Oh my God, there's a guy on second. What are they going to do? Are they going to bunt? That guy's going to score. It's so great. I was watching the Yankees and Marlins, a huge game on Friday night where the Marlins are trying to where the Marlins are trying to make it into the playoffs by winning. And we go extra innings. Marlins start with a runner on second. It's just instant drama. Then they score, but the Yankees in the bottom of the inning have a guy on second, and that's so tense, and it ends with bases loaded and LeMahieu hitting into a double play. It's the 10th inning was white knuckle from the jump. I loved it. So I really hope they keep that.
Yeah, that was a great example. I mean, the Yankees, that was just a clinic on how to lose.
It sure was.
By the way, Kyle Higashioka basically pegged the third base runner with the ball instead
hard
of
to do from 2 feet away, but
And I mean, it was a great win for the Marlins because LeMahieu was up with first and third, and he grounded into basically the only place you can ground into a double play with the corners in the infield right up the middle. That was a great example, actually. I'm glad you brought that up in terms of why that rule change is fun.
So exciting.
Because the 10th inning is just like every other inning, especially the top half, if that rule is not in place. It's just let's see if they score. The bottom half's exciting because you can walk it off, but it's still not it's not I agree with you that's been an exciting rule change.
Extra innings have gotten so bad in recent years too, because they're actually the 10th innings not like the rest of the innings. It's worse because guys are just trying to hit solo home runs for 4 hours. It's so boring. You don't get good at bats or anything. So this is just great, in my opinion.
All right, so let's do, in the absence of access, usually we ask Andy D's just to see who he would talk to in a normal circumstance where he's at the ballpark, which he wasn't able to be at this year in the clubhouse. Let's start with Dom Smith. So your answer was Dom Smith for 2 or 3 consecutive podcasts this year when he was having conversations with his teammates about the racial justice issues and everything that he was dealing with and how emotional he got after the game. You did finally, as you said last week, I could talk to him. I have that.
Wait a minute.
So you did have that conversation with him. What were your impressions?
Oh man, so it showed a lot of strength of character that he engage in these issues in the first place in the way that he did. But then when you talk to him in depth, there's another layer to it where sometimes, honestly, sometimes you want, when you have these kinds of conversations with athletes, like you want them to be a little more informed than they turn out to be. And you're like, all right, okay, that was an okay conversation. But Dom like brings it. He's passionate. He's smart. He knows exactly what he wants to do. Go back into the community. He's just so genuine, and so the conversation was just, isn't it just such an impressive guy. I've had several, let's put it this way, I've had several conversations with my son this year about Dom Smith, and it's like, look at this person, look what he's doing, look at the issues he's raising. This is something I want you to know about. I mean, what higher compliment could I give than that, right? Like, I think that whatever happened with the Mets this year, not making the playoffs, that night when they walked off the field with the Marlins will go down as an historic occasion in sports that was more significant than if the team had made the playoffs. A bigger event, of more memorable and more significant than a playoff appearance that night. And it was all because of Dom Smith and the way he made people think, his teammates. And I would say one of the most impactful things he told me when we had that conversation was he's got several teammates who want to come out to South Central LA in his community and work with him this offseason. So if you have a couple of white teammates out in the community only because they know Dom Smith, that is a real impact that he's actually had on some human beings that transcends the field of baseball. And he talks about it in a way, he's not like, let me tell you about the impact I've had. In fact, I will tell you that he has turned down way more media opportunities through this than he has accepted. There were national television shows and non-sports stuff, and everybody wanted to talk to Dom Smith for a while. And he didn't want to overplay his hand. He wanted it to be, he's not trying to elevate himself as a celebrity through this. He's just trying to do good.
So it's so interesting to hear that he told you a couple of his teammates want to come out to LA and learn what he's doing and the impact that they can make and the impact he's making. You talked about how much you were curious about how much resistance he facing in doing this and the conversations he was having. Did he give you any idea of what it was like in the clubhouse to have those conversations and people he talked to?
Good question.
Minds that he may have changed?
I think that it's an interesting question because I made it part of my job to talk to as many Black people in the game as I could for a while there when all this was going on. I called people, staffers, people I knew, and basically said, like, what's it going on behind closed doors? As a member of the media, what should I be writing? What should I be not writing? What questions should I be asking? I had a bunch of these kinds of conversations with people off the record before talking to Dom. And what I heard from people at other organizations was, dude, some of these conversations, they say tough conversations for a reason. Sometimes they were rough. Like Black players saying, you don't understand what it's been like for me with police and with other things my whole life, and white players not hearing it. And it got tough in some instances. So I brought that to Dom, and he was like, yeah, we sat in the clubhouse for hours and hours that one night before the canceled game and hashed it out. But guys in the Mets, he said, were really willing to listen. I'm sure that there were plenty of guys who or at least some guys who quietly were like, I don't know. I watch Fox News. I don't think I agree with this. I'm not being sarcastic. I mean, that's the divide. But according to Dom, and I believe him, the Mets were able to create a legitimate conversation that got people somewhere inside. That's huge because a baseball team is more white and more politically conservative generally than a team in another majors than football and basketball. Say, look at the populations. So for a baseball team to be able to have these conversations and get somewhere on them is a real model to me for how they can happen in the rest of the country. How you can have people coming from different political and racial backgrounds to have these conversations and have these issues humanized. I think the Mets demonstrated that in a small way. I think it's really important what they did.
Well, it just goes to show you were talking about Dom declining to do the interviews that would have made him even more famous than a professional baseball player can sometimes be. And goes to show you that the important thing to him was to speak his mind,
Mhm.
be honest with all of us when he was asked, and to create these conversations in the clubhouse that he thought were really meaningful, and to make a difference in his own clubhouse that will end up making a difference to his hometown and his neighborhood. And I just think that shows you that his intentions were as pure as they can be.
100%.
And that's really cool. And I think that's a great place to end our, the in-season part of our conversation, because this is something that, we've talked about and kind of teased as a topic for a while now. And it's good work by you to talk to him after you had been so curious to do so. And I think all of us can applaud, obviously, not just the on-field performance of Dom Smith this year, but the fact that is a major takeaway from the 2020 season for the Mets, that he is just such a good ambassador for this club. That for Major League Baseball, who needs more Black players, who needs young Black kids to be interested in the game and to see role models in the game for them to try and be. And I think Dom is the perfect role model for kids across the country and in the world to play this game.
So I mean, 100%. He has exceeded. Like I said, his gesture could have been great, but then his words are great. His intentions are great. It was just a total positive that he was representing the Mets in this year of incredible racial disharmony in this country. He was a positive figure.
So again, everybody, this has been the Shea Anything podcast. We will be coming at you every Monday, all off season long. We'll talk with Andy again next week, but we'll talk with Keith on Thursday before this week is done. And again, we'll be here all off season to talk Mets baseball with you. It should be a busy one. Andy, thank you. Thanks for listening, everybody. Please subscribe, rate, and review once again wherever you listen to your podcast. We appreciate it. And we'll talk to you on Thursday.